We're back. I think we're good to go, so we're going to get started here with session 2. Once again, my name is Andy Steiger, and this is Wesley Huff. And first session, we talked about the right books. In this session, we talked about the right text. Before we get into things, I do just want to note that it was interesting traveling in Egypt. And one of the spots there, you saw that we had to have a police escort for most of our time there. And in fact, the police would even come with us and stay in the hotel as well. And in one instance as well, we even had lunch with them because they traveled really far with us.
And that was mostly for our safety. They just wanted to make sure that the tourists were not getting lost in the desert.
Because we weren't going to like normal touristy spots.
No,
they're like, we don't want these guys to die out here.
Yeah. when we say that it was a 45, 50 degrees, it felt like that. Like it felt like an oven, and they wanted to make sure that we weren't just roasting out somewhere random.
But the police almost died. So we didn't, but they almost did.
You know what's funny about the sandstorm that we featured in the first video is that, so the sandstorm's happening, the power's gone out, we have no AC or fans, that's not working, so we're roasting. And then our guide comes in, knocks on our door, and he says, hey guys, you know, this is a totally safe place, don't worry about anything, but sometimes the sandstorms blow scorpions in. So, you know, make sure before you get in your bed, you know, shake out your sheets and look in your shoes. And the police officer was with us. He's like, he had to flick a scorpion off his arm. He's totally fine, everything's fine, but just make sure.
He was not happy with where we had brought him and that he had scorpions flying on him. It was pretty amusing. But it was interesting as well that there was a heavy police presence because, as we said, there are so much archaeological discoveries that have yet to be made. They have to do quite a bit of policing to actually make sure that people aren't going in there and taking stuff as well. Well, as we were looking at the text of the Bible, one of the things that is really important to appreciate about the Christian Bible is that we do not believe that the Bible is a magic book. And I hope that that's not, a surprise to you. But it is interesting how some people will approach the Bible as a magic book. And in fact, you'll often see this even with movies. You'll have this idea, particularly horror movies or something, where they've got to, say this Latin incantation. And if they say it just right, they'll, have this curse or whatever that will happen. And I think a lot of people kind of have a similar view, Wes, of the Bible. They'll think, or they could, that there's, power in the words. But from the Christian tradition, we don't think that there's power in the words of the Bible. We think there's power in the meaning of the Bible. And that's a significant idea. And it's one of the reasons why the early Christians and as well with the Jews in the Old Testament, that the Bible has not stopped being translated and copied into other languages.
And I think in regards to the Old Testament, there are some interesting portions of the Old Testament. I mentioned at the beginning of the video there that there are 3 languages that we find the Bible in its original text. 2 major languages, Greek and Hebrew, and 1 minor language, Aramaic. And the Aramaic portions are Old Testament, and they're primarily in places like Daniel and in some of the prophets in Ezekiel and Isaiah. And part of the reason for that is that Aramaic was the language of the ancient Near East. When the Israelites were in exile in Babylon, they were speaking Aramaic. That's what the lingua franca was at that time. And so they go back to Jerusalem speaking Aramaic. But the Aramaic portions of the Old Testament are actually addresses to the people of the surrounding nations in their own language. So when you're reading Daniel chapter 4 and it has an address by Nebuchadnezzar, it's an address in the language he would have spoken in to people who would have understood that language. So there's even this aspect of that the Old Testament is unique in that it's primarily in Hebrew, but there are sections that are addressed specifically to the nations surrounding in the language which they would have understood. And the New Testament was translated very quickly, very early into a host of other languages in order for that gospel message to go out.
And it's just important to appreciate that this is not true of other religious traditions. You can see this within, say, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, for example. They'll tend to see that language that it's written, whether it be Sanskrit or Arabic, as that there's power in that word and even memorizing. I remember you telling me once that you met a guy who had almost memorized the entire Quran.
Yeah, so I knew a guy, he was an older Indonesian man who I was meeting with, and we were reading portions of the Quran and the Bible together I was in an effort that I was trying to connect with him and evangelize to him. And he had almost memorized the entire Quran, which sounds like a lot, but if you think about, the Quran is about the size of the first 3 Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which is still a lot. I mean, you try to memorize the entire Gospel of Matthew, it's going to be a feat. But it's not like memorizing the entire Bible. But he told me one time, he said, Wes, I love my religion. I love the Quran. I love memorizing it and repeating it. And one day I'd like to get it in a language that I understand so that I can read it myself. And it was because he spoke English and he spoke Indonesian. He didn't speak a word of Arabic. But it almost didn't matter. It was the act of devotion and the kind of magic, like you said, of the repeating and repetition of those words in not just Arabic, but 7th century Hijizi script Arabic, which is what the Quran is written in.
Yeah, and again, you'll often see that in like Buddhism, for example, where they'll get into these different mantras and whatnot, but they don't know what they're saying. My point is that from a Christian perspective, the meaning is what matters, and so it shouldn't surprise you that we have so many translations and copies of the Bible. This is a part of that tradition, and wanting to get it into other people's hands. And I can't help but think too, this is probably why education has always gone hand in hand with Christianity, is to help people to actually be able to access the meaning. Now, one of the things that we talked about in the series is that chapter and verse divisions is not original to the Bible. Those were added later. So when were they added and why were they added?
Yeah, well, the chapter divisions come around in the Middle Ages. There was Old Testament chapter divisions in around the early Middle Ages. There were actually evidence of divisions within the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in some 4th century Bibles, we can see where they're actually starting to divide things. And there's actually, and we showed it a number of times on the screen, a late 2nd century, early 3rd century copy of the Gospel of John called P66. And specifically in John chapter 1, it has division dots almost exactly where we would put the verses in the first 18 verses, which is really interesting, that even in the late 2nd century, they were dividing up the Bible almost exactly where we do today. But our modern chapter and verse divisions are borrowed, the Old Testament ones, from the Jewish Bible in the Middle Ages that the Jewish rabbis put together themselves. And then there was a guy named Scrivener, Robert Scrivener, in the 17th century who put together our verse divisions. And that's what was carried over eventually into both the Latin Bible and in the Greek Bible, and then eventually into our English Bibles today. But they're a later ascription that was adopted basically unanimously throughout the Christian world.
Now, one thing you noticed in the video was that Oxyrhynchus is a garbage dump. That is where they found all these manuscripts. And that is often where archaeologists will find their greatest treasures, is in the dump. But it's like a blessing and a curse simultaneously, because you don't throw your best stuff into the dump, right? It's normally what's been used up. It's old, it's tattered and beat up, and then you throw it in there, and then we find it 2,000 years later, and we're excited to go through all that garbage. But I find it fascinating, like how big this garbage dump was in Oxyrhynchus, that they found nearly 500,000 fragments of manuscripts. And I'm wondering, Wes, okay, where are they keeping all of those, and have they gone through them all?
Yeah, so the Oxyrhynchus collection was discovered, like I said in the video, between 1895 and 1897. And they found so much that they were just putting them in cookie and coffee tins and sending them back to Oxford. And there's a good portion of those that are still sitting in the basement of the Sackler Library at Oxford that we haven't gone through, that haven't been sort of pieced together, because a lot of them are very fragmentary. Because the older these things are, the more and more broken up they are. So, I mean, you and I wouldn't look that good after 1,800 years. Some of these look pretty good after 1,800 years. And so a lot of these are still yet to be really investigated and published. But the Oxyrhynchus collection actually comes out with updated publications. There was a publication of the Oxyrhynchus papyri last year, which published newly, not discovered, but examined and put forth to both the academic and public communities last year. So we're still publishing these manuscripts that were dug up in the 19th century, but we've been digging manuscripts up from the site at Oxyrhynchus for the last 200 years.
Wow. In the video series, one of the things you said is that our Bible has been changed. And I think that might, be a little concerning to some. What do you mean the Bible has been changed? And so I want to drill down a little bit more into that. Like, what do you mean by that? So let's just begin with what are some minor changes that we're talking about here?
Yeah, so a lot of the changes are the ones we talked about in terms of the ones that are non-purposeful. They're the spelling errors, the word differences. That really...
and I think that's interesting, by the way, spelling errors and just differences in that. This one surprised me, is that it's not like they had a dictionary. Spelling wasn't standardized. And that's just, again, one of those things that we kind of take for granted.
Which was true in English for a long, long time. Until you get people like Webster coming around and writing the dictionary, we didn't have standardized spelling. Individuals like the famous Bible translator John Wycliffe was famous for spelling his name different multiple times when he signed his signature. And it's because it didn't matter. They knew what he was saying because
Close enough.
All the letters, all the main letters. Yeah. Yeah, Andy, all his emails. He's like, well, it wasn't standardized for so long. But I think there's that level of alteration where it's completely unintentional. And we can pick those out pretty clearly. It's obvious. The ones that are purposeful are not, almost never purposeful for nefarious reasons. A lot of the time, and this is actually the case with the one that we addressed, John chapter 5, verse 4, they are commentary marginal notes that scribes write in the margins to expand upon what's going on. So John chapter 5 is a story of the healing at the pool of Bethesda. And a scribe, probably somewhere in the 4th century, writes what that pool is, where there was this story that an angel would come down, who would stir the waters, and then the lame and crippled people would try to get into the water to be the first one to touch the bubbling water, and this, they thought, would heal them. Well, that was written in the margin, and a scribe later on copying that manuscript, not knowing whether the previous scribe forgot to put it in the text or whether there was a commentary that was written to expand upon the text, to be safe, includes it within the text. And this is what I mean when in the series I say we don't have 100% of the text, we have 110% of the text. Is what that does is it gives us a lot of confidence to say the original is in there. It's there. It's not missing. The scribes were, and the word I used was tenacious to preserve the text so much that they're willing to include things with the idea that, and this is what we can do because of we have so much information, is figure it out eventually. The other thing is that we also see patterns on things that we refer to as the expansion of piety. So when early manuscripts say Jesus, sometimes scribes will add Jesus Christ. And then later scribes will add our Lord Jesus Christ. And so you get this the text going larger and larger and larger. Now, is it wrong to say our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? No. But is that what, say, maybe Matthew wrote originally? Maybe he just wrote Jesus. But once again, we have so much evidence that we're able to see these developments over time and literally watch the text expand and then look back and say, okay, we can trace this back and we can actually figure out with a really strong degree of confidence what the original authors actually wrote.
Now, some of these, though, those are minor ones. Some of them are much larger. For example, one of the ones that was mentioned in the session was the woman caught in adultery. And another one would be the alternate ending of Mark. Now, if you're unfamiliar with if you look in your Bible, by the way, the Bible is not trying to hide these. If you go look in your modern Bible, you'll see if there's ever a question about a text, it's footnoted. And then sometimes it'll actually be like the alternate ending to Mark is actually included in the text and it's italicized. And I encourage you to take a look at it. But where did that come from? When do we start seeing this alternate ending of Mark, and what do we do with something like that?
Yeah, so the only textual variances, textual differences within the manuscript tradition of the New Testament that are more than 12 words long are the longer ending of Mark and the story of the woman caught in adultery. Those are the only examples that we have of if someone wants to point to like a big addition. And these traditions develop very early on. I think we can say two things. I think we can say that there are stories that are floating around about Jesus within the early Jesus community because we know...
Which shouldn't surprise us.
No, it shouldn't surprise us. John says that even if we tried to write everything down that Jesus did, we wouldn't be able to, even if the whole sky was a scroll, we wouldn't be able to write it down. So there are obviously things that Jesus did that are not included in our Gospels. Now that
was part of the oral tradition.
Right. And I think this is what we can say with something like the story of the woman caught in adultery, which we know because of the manuscript evidence was not written by John, but it has this flavor of being an authentic Jesus story. So some New Testament scholars have referred to it as their favorite verse of the Bible that's not in the Bible, because it has this air of authenticity of a Jesus story. It matches with what we understand of who Jesus is. This longer ending of Mark is a little bit different because when you look at the full text of after when it says that the women were afraid and they did not tell anyone, you'll see it's either, like you mentioned, it's either italicized or sometimes it's in square brackets. That, what's included in your modern Bible, is actually an amalgamation of 3 different endings that we find in the manuscript tradition. Because there's a development of scribes either being uncomfortable with it ending so abruptly, or they're trying to synthesize what you find in the other Gospels with it. I don't think this is done for, once again, nefarious purposes. I think their intention is well-intentioned. They want to try to finish the story. But I think we can definitively say it's most likely not original, and that early scribes were uncomfortable with it ending so abruptly. Some scholars think that actually we're missing the ending. I don't necessarily think that's true, but there is this development over time.
Well, and this is, I think, an interesting point. Was this a surprise, or have we known this for a long time?
We have known this for 1,800 years because the scribes have noted this all the way along. In fact, Andy and I were talking about this the other day, and I have a facsimile, a photocopy of a 4th century codex in my office that I use for my academic work. And I pulled it up and I showed him, when you have these books, they usually, when one gospel ends, the next gospel starts right away. But for Mark, there's 2 whole sections that are blank. And the reason they did that was because they knew that some copies included this, but a lot of them didn't. And so just to be safe, they left a blank section in case a later scribe could confirm whether it was original so that they could go back and add it. But we have early church fathers noting that some copies have it, some copies don't. And actually, I think it's Origen and Tatian both say our earliest copies don't have it. So we have these discussions going right back to the early church. It's not a surprise. In a similar way, when we find the Gnostic Gospels, it's not shocking us. We have the church talking about this all the way along. When we find out that certain verses are, quote unquote, missing or are being added, we have scribes talking about this all the way along, adding notations in the margins and doing things like leaving room for the actual passage.
Tell them about the notation that actually is in the film, where the scribe has written in the margins. What does it say?
Yeah, so there's a manuscript called Codex Vaticanus, which is a 4th century codex of what we would consider a Bible, Genesis to Revelation copy of the Bible. It's one of our earliest. And in the book of Hebrews, there is a section where a scribe has written the text, a later scribe has come and corrected the text in a certain place, and then another scribe has come and they've erased the correction, and in the margin they've written, "Fool and idiot, leave the original reading and do not change it."
Like we said, they were tenacious. Let's talk about dating. By that I mean dating.
I've been married for a long time.
When would you date the Gospels in the New Testament?
So I think this is an interesting question because my area of expertise is in copies, and there's a different question in regards to the dating of the copies and what's called compositional dating. Compositional dating is when Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, Jude, James, when they actually wrote, when they put pen to papyrus, when they wrote that document. That's a completely different conversation to when are our earliest manuscripts, our earliest copies coming into existence. But if we're talking about compositional dating, I think there's a range of arguments for Is this early? Is this really close to the time of Jesus? Is this being written a little later on in subsequent decades? I think no matter where you date these, no matter what the discussion or arguments back and forth are, I think we can say pretty conclusively that no matter what, all of the 27 books that we refer to as the New Testament are from the 1st century and in the living memory of the eyewitnesses of those events. So there are checks and balances because there would have been people who were there who could have said, this doesn't make any sense. And there was the early Jesus community, some of whom knew Jesus personally or were there at the feeding of the 5,000, those kind of things, who can confirm these details. So there are excellent arguments for, say, dating things before the kind of definitive date of 70 AD when Rome destroys Jerusalem and destroys the temple in Jerusalem. And there are strong arguments for that. In fact, there's a scholar who wrote a book called Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament. His last name is Bernier. And he makes a strong case for dating everything pre-70. I think there are convincing arguments for that, but I don't think we need to rely necessarily on that. If we date every book of the New Testament late, it doesn't affect its credibility and its reliability, because even some of the agreed upon earliest books that were written, like the Gospel of Mark, we have our latest attestation in the manuscripts. Our earliest manuscripts are still relatively late. And so despite the discussions, we're still tying these documents to the earliest Jesus community no matter what.
And there's interesting ways too, by the way, that we can date the Bible internally, where we can see things like in Acts chapter 12, where we're told that at the time of Herod Agrippa, who ends up in Acts 12 dying, that this is actually when James, the brother of John, dies, which is the only 2 disciples we're told that die in the New Testament is Judas and James, the brother of John. And we're told when it happened. And so we know that's okay, around 44 AD. So then now we can start to go, okay, well, now we understand, okay, that's happening then. And then when we're reading, we're going, okay, and we're not reading that Peter has died. Like, we're not told that Peter's died. We're not told that the other disciples have died. And so that gives us some understanding then of when these were written, yeah?
Yeah, those are those internal arguments that we make. Like the names that we talk about in session 1, these are ways that we can internally look at the content of the text and pinpoint it in a particular time in a particular place.
Here's a question about translation. Why are translations like the Message and the Passion Translation so problematic if there are so many other translations with discrepancies?
Yeah, so the question of translation falls on a continuum of what's called dynamic and formal equivalence. So that's basically the difference between, are you trying to translate closest to the original wording of the text, or are you translating it in a way that tries to make it as clear in the modern language that you're translating in?
So word for word or thought for thought?
Yeah, that's another way of putting it. Word for word or thought for thought. So there are a number of examples like this. In the Gospel of Luke, in a very word for word translation, there's a section where Jesus is talking to the disciples, and a really word for word translation, like the New American Standard Bible or the ESV, translates what Jesus says as, "Let these words sink into your ears." Because that's literally what Jesus said. Let these words sink into your ears. Now, the NIV, which is much more of a thought for thought translation, translates that as, listen carefully to what I'm about to say. Why? Because that's what that phrase means. Listen carefully to what I'm about to say. But those aren't actually the words that Jesus said. He said, let these words sink into your ears. So translations fall on a continuum, and not all translations are going to be just a thought for thought or just a word for word translation, because it doesn't work like that. The way that when you translate anything, that's going to change from testament to testament, book to book, chapter to chapter, maybe even verse to verse. When we're dealing with something like the Message or the Passion, and I might put those in a different category, both of them, the Message is a paraphrase. So it's not necessarily a translation of looking at the Greek and the Hebrew and translating it directly from those original languages. It's a paraphrase of the words in order to paraphrastically go beyond even what a thought for thought translation might do. The Passion Translation...
By the way, that's why you I've never seen and wouldn't encourage somebody preaching from the message, for example.
No.
Now reading from it's different. We're talking about,
Yeah.
would I be preaching from that passage? No, I wouldn't do that.
I think paraphrases often get a bad rap. I'm not actually that negative towards paraphrases. I think they have a purpose, and I think they actually have a place. However, we have such good thought translations that I think most of the time a paraphrase is unnecessary. The Passion Translation, I think, is more problematic because the individual, a single individual who translated it, has said that he personally has received divine revelation in order to translate it in a way, and he actually, I think, goes so far beyond what the original text says that he's actually inserted his own ideas and concepts. And I would actually rather someone read a Jehovah's Witness New World Translation than actually the Passion Translation. That's how many liberties I think the Passion Translation takes with the text.
I think we'd also just say one other thing with regards to that when we're looking at our modern Bibles, it is a team of scholars that are translating that together, whereas the Passion was translated by one person.
Yeah, and so was the Message. But once again, it's almost in a different category. It's not a translation, but your ESV or NASB or NET or NIV, all those ones that probably come to your mind when you're thinking of a modern Bible translation, have a team of experts, theologians, Bible translators, and scholars that are going to weed out any one individual's bias in any particular way.
Just a couple questions left here. How do you know that Luke got Pontius Pilate correct while others did not?
Because of the archaeological data. So when we have inscriptions like the Pontius Pilate stone, which was found in the 1960s in Israel, in Caesarea Maritime, what that is a dedication stone saying specifically who Pontius Pilate was, that he himself went there and he dedicated this building project, and it has his correct title. So the thing with Tacitus is that he actually gets two things wrong when he talks about the Christians. First, he thinks Christus is a name and refers to Jesus as Christus as a Greek name. That's incorrect. Christ is a title, not a name. And then he gets Pontius Pilate's title wrong as well by saying that he was the procurator, which is an entirely different... It's like saying right now, Trudeau is a judge on the Supreme Court. Well, we know he's not. He's the prime minister. So Tacitus just gets that wrong, and we can corroborate that by external data that will, both written data, but in this case, specifically archaeological inscriptions.